So a new talk for you. I like taking this theory and applying it to the new exoplanets that are found. The discovery of Wolf 1061 Charlie, or C. I use Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, all that stuff. But Charlie, I'll just say Charlie. This is Charlie. He or she is 4.3 times the mass of the Earth, and its radius is a little over one and a half times the radius of the Earth. So what I think we're dealing with here is an ocean world. Definitely an ocean world. Definitely a very thick ocean world. Completely covered in deep, deep water oceans. And of course, there's a lot of atmospheric material in there too that's very different than the Earth's current atmosphere. I'm supposing there's probably a lot of methane and hydrogen still in this atmosphere as well. But forward, it orbits its host at around 17.9 days. That's its whole year. And the temperature on it is a little bit warmer than Mars, though. The equilibrium temperature of 223 Kelvin, which is about -50 Celsius, -58 degrees Fahrenheit. So about, it's cold, the equilibrium temperature. I didn't write down the fact that these people, they think it's tidally locked to the red dwarf. No, the red dwarf, the host, is 0.25 the mass of the sun, and they're saying that Charlie here is tidally locked, which means it only faces one side to the red dwarf. And I'm going to argue in the future that that's probably not true, because there hasn't been enough time for it to become tidally locked. Plus, it has too much spin angular momentum. When you have an ocean world like that, it has a lot of mass, and it's still spinning quite rapidly. There's no way that this thing's tidally locked. So whenever you see them saying, when astronomers say, well, it's tidally locked, remember, there's a lot of assumptions that they're placing in their mind that make it so, but all those assumptions are false. The majority of those assumptions are false. Forward, I went ahead and cut and paste, or I screenshotted Wolf's Wikipedia page in case, they change it and then they, hide the fact that they changed it. This is a good archive type thing. Like, I got you, Can't hide. I know what you said. There's a lot to unpack here. In the beginning statement, they have Wolf 1061 Charlie, or just Charlie, orbiting in what they would consider to be the habitable zone of the host. Unfortunately, this is myopic. A star's habitable zone is external to the star when it is young, but it eventually internalizes. This means, given Charlie is an ocean world, it actually has two habitable zones. It is a liquid water ocean that life can swim and evolve in, as well orbits in the external habitable zone of the red dwarf. There's double habitable zones, external and internal, which lead credibility to the possibility of life being on Charlie in fish form. So yeah, for those people who are new to this theory still, the habitable zone of a star when it's young is external to the star. It's an area outside of the star, like a halo area where the star can keep another host, can keep liquid water on the surface. It can keep it warm, not too hot to where the water boils away, not too cold to where the water freezes over into a giant ice world, but right in the middle, the Goldilocks zone, so to speak. But that habitable zone shrinks. That big halo around the star shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And as the star loses energy and loses its mass and evolves, that Goldilocks zone becomes internal to the star, which means it then has its own internal habitable zone, and it can have life start forming in that area as it evolves very far into its evolution. This meaning when the star starts forming its own internal habitable zone, it can wander the galaxy and go wherever the hell it wants to go and not even need to orbit another hotter host to keep it warm. It keeps itself warm as it forms the life inside of its interior. Of course, the life is a very complex process, and I don't want to go into that aspect of this theory, but basically that's what it means. The habitable zone shrinks. So with Charlie here, Charlie has an internal habitable zone and an external habitable zone because it's in the external habitable zone of a red dwarf. So that's double possibility. Earth is like that. Earth has a double habitable zone. We have hydrothermal vents in the bottom of the ocean, which have life swarming around it, that are completely independent of the heat of the sun. Yet on the surface, you have water on the surface of the Earth, and well, that's obvious. Earth has a double habitable zone, and that's one aspect of having life available for the star. You need to look for stars that have two habitable zones. They have both an internal and an external, which means Earth orbits inside the sun's habitable zone, external one, and Earth has its own still. But eventually when the Earth dies and the internal heat ceases and the hydrothermal vents, seize up, and all the heat is already dissipated, then Earth is just going to completely rely on being in orbit around a hotter host. And then if Earth doesn't find a hotter host, then there's not going to be any chance for life at all. It's going to become a dead world. All stars as defined. Okay, wait a second. Oh, wait, yeah. Secondly, Wikipedia experts say Charlie is the 5th closest known exoplanet. This is false. All stars as defined by the dogma are the youngest exoplanets. Stars and exoplanets are not mutually exclusive constructs. You guys know this. This means the 5th closest exoplanet is either Lumen 16A or Lumen 16 Bravo, or Alpha or Bravo, which are both intermediate-aged brown dwarfs. For those new to this theory, brown dwarfs are intermediate-aged stars. They bridge the gap between the youngest exoplanets that shine and the oldest ones that barely externally radiate from an observational standpoint. And that's the main issue here. With this type of statement, you can tell that the astronomers still don't know what they're talking about. They still believe that there are independent objects here. They're not. They're looking at specific stages of a star's evolution. And when we look at the youngest stars, the ones that are really bright and hot and big, you're looking at the young Earths. And we should expect that there are huge amounts of objects between Earth size, Mercury size, and the largest, hottest exoplanets, which, can shine. We can see them with our telescopes, and even at night, with our eyes. And brown dwarfs are those intermediate stages where they make the transition from being bright and shining to finally, completely internalizing their heat, and, their habitable zone internalizes as well. Here's another issue. They also call it a triple planetary system, which again clarifies their misguided viewpoint. All planetary systems are star systems. Planets are older stars. Saying one system is a star system and the other is a planetary system is redundant and outdated. They are viewing at least a quadruple star system, a young red dwarf in the center with 0.25 the mass of the sun, and 3 older stars that are in much more advanced stages of evolution. So there are 4 stars total. This is overviewed in the paper on stellar polymetamorphism. This is going to be a huge issue. They're still trying to separate a star system from a planetary system. They don't realize it's the same damn thing. So what's going to happen is they're going to find things like 2 sun-like stars orbiting each other, red dwarfs orbiting each other really, really fast. And then they're going to find a star over here from their definition, and a star over here, and they're going to be orbiting each other. And then they're just going to be doing like one of these numbers. And then you're going to throw planets in the mix, and then they're going to be orbiting too. So it's like, when does the craziness end? When do we stop trying to pigeonhole what a difference between a star system and a planetary system is? I don't know. Maybe one day they'll wake up from it. But another issue is that they refuse to acknowledge the time variable in planet formation. They classify Charlie as a super Earth. Their qualifier is stated in terms of size, a super meaning larger Earth, which signals that they do not understand its mass is being lost slowly, and it has already lost vast quantities of its mass very early in its evolutionary history. The qualifier super signals it is super right now, and then blocks their minds to looking at the possibility that it was far more super. And that's important to realize here, is that if you use language in a weird way, you sort of paint your reality with those words. And then you make it to where you have to supersede those weird definitions as you go along. So by the astronomers saying it's a super Earth, it signals to me that they didn't expect these things because they're not thinking about the consequences for the words they're using. And here's one of the major consequences. It's like saying things like super and then ultra or mega and then giga and whatever, and it sort of loses meaning. Like young planets like the sun are mega Earths, Neptunes are ultra Earths, and so on and so forth. The qualifiers that center on mass, when mass is a lost physical property during the star's evolution, is misguided and will lead to confusion. It is much more reasonable to give a qualifier that signals a time variable in stellar evolution. It is a post-Neptune or an ocean world, which also uses a qualifier that describes a physical characteristic outside of size alone. And that's important because the astronomers, when they look at these objects, they only classify them in terms of, size, super or this or that, but they never say post or pre. They never say, they do say sometimes ocean world, and they do use some type of qualifiers, but what I'm saying is they need to move away from using a qualifier which pigeonholes their mind into thinking, oh, this is how it started, this is how it ended, it wasn't a lot bigger in its past, and it's not going to be any smaller than what it is right now. It's super now, it couldn't have been any more super, and it will always remain super. It's not going to be, what's the opposite of super? I don't know. Okay. Yeah, basically it signals to me that their hands are tied behind their backs. They cannot say the star evolved to that point like a post-Neptune because that conflicts with their nebula hypothesis. It makes them stake out, how dare you say the nebula hypothesis is wrong? You're a crank, you're a crackpot, and you get blacklisted and people, they shoo you away, like, get away from me, like, you're not allowed to think differently because, you'll upset our funding train. We don't want to associate with you because, money's involved. But as well, they do not yet know the physical characteristics of the surface, but they could if they studied theories outside of the dogma. If they study the theory I'm developing, they'd immediately get it. Of course, you have objects that are slightly larger than the Earth, more than likely they're ocean worlds. It's pretty simple. And here's another big one. This is pretty cool. They do not have the age of the red dwarf Wolf 1061, as they say it is poorly constrained. But this is not a problem inside the general theory. It is a rule of thumb that the age of red dwarfs is less than 350 million years old. They're young stars. As well, we can even be more exacting by taking the mass and rotational velocity and calculating the total angular momentum. This can tell us how old it is using gyrochronology as defined inside of the general theory. And more work needs to be done. And gyrochronology means the total angular momentum of the star can be used to determine how old it is. Like, think of a spinning top. When you spin a top on a table, how fast that top is spinning obviously was really, really fast and high energy when it first started spinning, but then eventually the spin slows down and it stops altogether. The same thing with stars. They have a lot of angular momentum when they're young, and as they lose their mass and as they evolve, the angular momentum is lost and they start spinning really, 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 really slowly. And think about Venus and Mercury. Those things spin extremely slowly. I think Venus's year is longer, or no, its day is longer than its year. So it takes longer for it to spin around than it does to orbit the sun completely, which is completely weird. I think that's correct. I don't know, I might have that backwards. And finally, the Wikipedia article places Wolf 1061, the red dwarf, as being able to burn for 400 to 500 billion years. This is also misguided. The possible age of Wolf 1061 is into the tens of trillions of years, but it won't be bright and burning the entire time. Mercury is an example in this regard, as is between 7 and 32.75 trillion years old, as measured from its DH ratios and its gyrochronology. As well, acceptance of the idea that young stars like Wolf 1061 can remain hot and bright for hundreds of billions of years is outdated. Earth is about 4.5 billion years old, and I forgot to write 4.5, maybe 10 billion years old, per Daniel Archer. I know he's been harping on me about that, but I'm sorry, dude. I forgot to write that in here. And still has a molten mantle in its interior, but it is cooled far beyond being able to shine, and even has things like mountains, a thick crust in some places, and oceans, along with a 1 billion cubic kilometer iron-nickel core. Stars do not remain bright, large, and hot in their youthful stages for hundreds of billions of years. They cool down and lose their mass by incredible proportions. By the time Wolf 1061 reaches 350 million years old, it will be too cool to be seen strongly in the visible spectrum. It will be mostly visible as a brown dwarf star in the infrared spectrum, and then after about 1 billion years, it will resemble Neptune or Uranus, which radiate very weakly. They have a much lower bolometric luminosity as compared to brown dwarf stars. To say Wolf 1061 will remain in red dwarf stages of evolution for almost as long as Venus's age of 450 to 750 billion years means they have confused their math equations for reality. Venus is between 450 and 750 billion years old. That's what a star looks like that's hundreds of billions of years old. And the dogma says a red dwarf can remain a red dwarf and bright and shining and hot and the same mass and everything for hundreds of billions of years too. That's totally misguided. If that were true, then Venus wouldn't exist. Mercury wouldn't exist. There wouldn't be these dead stars that are hundreds of billions of years old. They're made of rocks and minerals. See, and that's the problem with a lot of astronomers and mathematicians. They confuse their theoretical models and their assumptions about the world around them with actual observations. So naturally, when you have a theoretical model and you teach these theoretical ideas and then you make the observations are telling you one thing and your theoretical model is telling you something else. But instead of throwing the theoretical model away and going with the observations, what's happening is that they're taking a theoretical model and trying to force it to be correct. The transcendence of astronomy is being lost upon astrophysicists and mathematicians, because the mathematicians, as they say, though, we have the perfect math equations and all this other shit. But it's not. They're putting the cart before the horse. The horse has to come before the cart. You have to make the observations, and then you can determine what happens to the stars after you have made the correct observations. But instead, they're going off the theoretical deep end. And like I said in my earlier video, they just never came back from it. And in the age of exoplanets, when we realize that the very old stars have been mislabeled exoplanets, there's going to be a huge awakening. But I've yet to see that happen. But anyways, I think I made this video long enough. Hopefully you guys, I'll post this Victor paper at the bottom once it comes up. I just put it on there. It hasn't been posted yet. All right, later y'all.